If a woman walks down the aisle 8 times, some call it romantic, others call it reckless. But what if each wedding wasn't just about love, but survival in a world that profits off her image and punishes her choices? Elizabeth Taylor was adored, envied, and immortalized as the Queen of Hollywood. But here's a truth many gloss over: beneath the diamonds, beneath the Cleopatra gowns, and beneath the gossip headlines, lay a woman consistently robbed of agency, cornered by a studio system that saw her as property, not a person. She wasn't just living in the spotlight, she was trapped in it. And the real question is, did Elizabeth Taylor ever truly belong to herself? Welcome to Tragedy Uncovered, the channel where we look beyond the red carpets and photo ops, and into the long shadows cast by celebrity. If you're ready to confront what fame really costs, hit that subscribe button now. What we uncover tonight might just shift the way you see not only Elizabeth Taylor, but the entire machine that made and broke her. Now, let's begin. From a very young age, Elizabeth Taylor became the product of two forces. 1. The wartime migration of her family from England to California. 2. The relentless ambitions of an American studio system. She wasn't just discovered. She was molded, marketed, and when necessary manipulated. By age 12, while filming National Velvet, Taylor suffered a severe back injury after a horse threw her to the ground. That injury would haunt her physically for the rest of her life. But even more lasting was the psychological pattern that started to take shape. Pain would be ignored, smoothed over with beauty, and packaged for the screen. Because the cameras never stopped rolling, not on set, and not in life. The head of MGM at the time, Louis B. Mayer, saw Elizabeth Taylor not as a child, but as a vehicle, a commodity, a way to sell stories. When Taylor's own mother, once a Broadway actress, allegedly became entangled in an affair with Mayer, it only cemented the girl's disillusionment with authority. Taylor would later describe Mayer as grotesque, egotistical, and manipulative, comparing him to a thick penguin who viewed every star as disposable. This wasn't just the studio era. This was the factory era, and Elizabeth Taylor was assembly line royalty. Fast forward to her teenage years, and the machinery behind the glamour turned darker. The studio didn't just book her films, they orchestrated her personal life. When she married hotel heir Conrad Hilton Jr., many believe the wedding was as much a PR stunt as it was a romantic decision. MGM reportedly paid for the dress, the lingerie, and even suggested the match because a storybook wedding could sell just as many tickets as a blockbuster. Behind the scenes, Hilton was abusive, addicted to gambling, and emotionally volatile. The marriage ended in 3 months, but the scars were permanent, not only on Taylor, but on the public's expectations of what her love life should look like. And here's the chilling part. When Taylor walked away from her abuser, MGM punished her. They forced her to star in a light-hearted romantic comedy as penance, a smiling face to wash over the bruises they refused to acknowledge. The message was clear: your pain is only valid if it sells. What began as a glittering Cinderella story was quickly mutating into something else, something far more tragic and far more disturbing. A cycle of control and coercion, dressed up in satin and sequins. And yet, the public couldn't look away. They saw the headlines, not the horror, the diamonds, not the damage. The roles she played on screen were romantic, glamorous, iconic, but off-screen, she was being cast again and again as the fallen woman, the temptress, the tragedy in designer heels. So let's pause for a moment and ask, if Elizabeth Taylor had been a man charming, impulsive, married multiple times, choosing love over protocol, would we have called her a legend or a liability? This is not about rewriting her life to suit modern values. This is about unearthing what the tabloids buried, a portrait of a woman who paid a lifetime price for being too desirable. too outspoken, and far too visible in a system that wanted her to shine, but never to lead. And we've barely scratched the surface. In the next chapter, we'll unravel her complex and controversial entanglement with Richard Burton, a relationship so explosive it changed Hollywood forever and brought the Vatican to denounce her by name. That's right. When was the last time the Pope condemned an actress for falling in love? Stick with us. This isn't a love story. This is a cautionary tale wearing a tiara. If Elizabeth Taylor's early years were scripted by studio heads, her adult life read like a screenplay no one dared to write. In part 1, we examined how the studio system commodified her, and how the public devoured every detail of her pain packaged as romance. But what happens when a woman decides to take the script back into her own hands and rewrites it on her own terms? One husband at a time? Enter Mike Todd. Unlike the studio-arranged marriage to Hilton or the crumbling emotional neglect with Michael Wilding, Mike Todd was different. He was a showman, loud, lavish, unpredictable, but for once, Elizabeth Taylor wasn't playing a part. With Todd, she was living. Genuinely. He didn't just love her. He celebrated her. When her birthday rolled around, he didn't give her jewelry, he gave her Madison Square Garden. Literally. He rented it out, invited 18,000 people, and had the whole thing broadcast on national television. It was the kind of love that felt invincible, big, bombastic, eternal. But it wasn't. In 1958, just as Taylor was set to begin filming Cat on a hot tin roof, tragedy struck. Mike Todd's private plane crashed, killing everyone on board. Elizabeth was supposed to be on that flight. The only reason she wasn't was because she had come down with a fever. That one change of schedule altered the rest of her life. She collapsed in grief. She began stuttering, a condition that hadn't plagued her since childhood. Her anguish was so severe that her character's southern accent in the film helped mask her inability to speak normally. Yet again, the show had to go on even if the star was crumbling inside. Many have called Mike Todd her one true love, and she often did too. But fate wasn't finished with her yet. Just as she reeled from the loss of one man, another entered, not quietly, not subtly, but with the kind of theatrical timing only Hollywood could conjure. That man was Eddie Fisher. The moment Elizabeth Taylor married Fisher, a media firestorm ignited. But it wasn't just because she remarried so quickly. It was because of who Fisher was, the husband of her close friend, America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds. And in the eyes of 1950s America, there were few sins greater than stealing the perfect housewife's perfect husband. Public backlash was swift and brutal. Newspapers branded her a homewrecker. Religious institutions denounced her publicly. And the phrase "Scarlet Woman" wasn't used metaphorically, it was practically tattooed on her. But pause. Was Elizabeth Taylor solely to blame? Eddie Fisher made a choice. Debbie Reynolds, for all her heartbreak, eventually forgave her. But the world didn't. Taylor would forever be cast not just as the woman with many husbands, but the woman who didn't know her place. She didn't apologize. She didn't retreat. That alone made her dangerous in a decade defined by female silence. Yet there was irony in it all. The marriage to Fisher, for which she was vilified, was one of her least passionate, most strategically public relationships. When Butterfield 8 was announced, casting Taylor as a call girl opposite her real-life husband, it seemed the lines between character and identity had collapsed completely. She hated the role. She refused to speak to the director during filming. And when she later won her first Academy Award for the performance, she famously quipped, "I still say it stinks." Still, the Oscar was hers. The scandal faded. And then came Cleopatra. The production of Cleopatra was one of the most expensive, most chaotic, most scrutinized in film history, and yet, it paled in comparison to the off-screen drama that erupted when Taylor met her co-star. the Welsh, magnetic, volatile Richard Burton. At the time, both were married, and both had reputations. Burton was known for his charisma and his thirst both for liquor and for danger. Taylor, already branded by the Fisher saga, now found herself thrust into another affair. Only this time, it wasn't just tabloid fodder. The Vatican issued a statement condemning her moral character. The public, still reeling from her last scandal, couldn't look away. The affair played out on magazine covers, in diplomatic debates, and even in national policy. Egyptian officials nearly barred her from entering the country because of her Jewish faith and her scandalous reputation. But the truth was this: Elizabeth and Richard were fire and gasoline. They fought, they drank, they devoured each other, and they couldn't stay away. Their love story was neither simple nor sweet. It was operatic, the kind of romance that destroyed everything in its path, including themselves. They married, then divorced, then married again, then divorced again. Burton gave Taylor one of the most famous diamonds in the world, 69 carats, insured for $1 million, only allowed to be worn 30 days per year. A symbol of love? Maybe. A symbol of excess? Certainly. But most of all, a symbol of something they both understood: beauty fades, but legacy is forever. And legacy, it turns out, is expensive. While filming Cleopatra, Taylor nearly died from a severe bout of pneumonia. She had to undergo an emergency tracheotomy. For a moment, the world believed she had passed. News outlets even published obituaries. She later described seeing a vision of her late husband Mike Todd, telling her it wasn't her time yet. The image is haunting. A woman loved by millions, surrounded by opulence, standing at the threshold between life and death, not called back by the voices of her children or fans or films, but by the man who once loved her without cameras rolling. What do we do with a woman like Elizabeth Taylor? Do we praise her for living boldly? Or do we reduce her to tabloid tropes, homewrecker, diva, addict, as she stood beneath the Cleopatra crown, earning $1 million, a record for any actress at the time? She wasn't just playing a queen. She was finally becoming one. Not in the fairy tale sense, but in the Shakespearean sense: flawed, powerful, and doomed to be misunderstood. And yet, her story didn't end there. Because even queens age. Even icons are human. And the price of immortality, as Elizabeth Taylor would soon discover, is that no one really wants you to be mortal. After 2 volcanic marriages with Richard Burton, Taylor found herself in unfamiliar territory, not as the center of every headline, but as a woman aging in an industry obsessed with youth, and a star no longer fitting the mold she helped create. And that's when reality struck, not all at once, but in steady, cruel waves. Her 7th marriage was to John Warner, a respected politician, a man of structure and order, everything Burton was not. For a time, it seemed Elizabeth Taylor might finally escape the tabloid machine and settle into a quieter life. But quiet, it turns out, isn't kind to those who've spent decades drowning in noise. Washington, D.C. wasn't Hollywood. It didn't flatter her, didn't orbit her presence, didn't offer adoration with every step. Instead, it left her cold, invisible. For a woman used to being the sun, becoming a shadow was unbearable. So she turned to something else: to alcohol, to prescription pills, to anything that could muffle the ache of being unwanted, not just by a man, but by the very public that once couldn't stop watching her. What made it worse was the silence. No paparazzi, no fanfare, just a growing awareness that she had become, in the eyes of many, a relic. But what those critics overlooked was that Taylor was never built to fade quietly. Even in addiction, even in despair, she remained defiant. When the cameras weren't rolling, she did something the media rarely credited her for: she listened. She cared, and she acted. When Rock Hudson, her close friend and co-star, died of AIDS in 1985, it shook her to the core. Hudson wasn't just a victim of a terrifying epidemic, he was a symbol of Hollywood's hypocrisy. An industry that glorified male beauty while denying the very existence of gay identity. A culture that celebrated his roles but erased his truth. Taylor didn't just mourn him, she mobilized. She co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR, long before it became fashionable for celebrities to attach themselves to causes. She raised over $80 million, not with carefully curated PR campaigns, but with grit, personal appearances, and unapologetic visibility. This, perhaps, was her most radical act, turning her fame into a weapon against injustice. But even as she championed others, her own body was waging war against her. The damage done by decades of surgeries, medications, accidents, and addiction began to accumulate. She underwent more than 40 operations. She faced skin cancer, heart failure, a brain tumor, and chronic pain so severe she often needed to be hospitalized over 100 times. In interviews, her vulnerability was plain. One moment with Barbara Walters revealed it all. "I never wanted to stop acting," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They just wouldn't insure me anymore." Imagine that a woman who had once earned the highest salary in Hollywood, who had carried films and studios and cultural shifts on her shoulders, was now deemed too risky to employ. Not because of talent, not because of skill, but because the very system that made her famous had burned her out and left her there. The ultimate betrayal wasn't from a man. It wasn't from a critic. It was from the machine itself, the one that demanded her beauty, her passion, her scandal, her perfection, and then discarded her when she couldn't deliver it anymore. It's no coincidence that in this stage of her life, Taylor often found solace not in the company of celebrities, but in animals. She famously quipped, "Some of my best leading men have been dogs and horses." And she meant it. Her loyalty to those who offered unconditional love, whether friends, pets, or the marginalized, never wavered. She even wrote a children's book inspired by one of her animal co-stars. And in a move that feels both absurd and deeply human, she once docked her dogs offshore on a yacht to avoid Britain's quarantine laws. Extravagant? Perhaps, but also telling. In a world that had tried to contain her every move, she would still find a way to protect what she loved. But not even diamonds or yachts could protect her from the final tragedy of her life, the slow, public erasure of the person beneath the legend. The magazines stopped chasing her. The film offers dried up. And yet, she remained stubborn, iconic, deeply human. Which brings us to Richard Burton again. After their final divorce, Taylor never remarried him, though many suspected she would. But what the world didn't know was that shortly after Burton died in 1984, Taylor received a letter from him. The contents were never made fully public, but she said enough. In his words, Burton expressed his longing to come home, and home, in his mind, was Elizabeth. She kept that letter by her bedside until the day she died. Out of all the headlines, out of all the jewels and affairs and Oscars and gowns, that letter was the one thing she never shared. Not even with the public that claimed to own her story. It's hard not to wonder, if Burton had lived just a little longer, would they have found their way back to each other? Would the third time have been the charm or the final undoing? What we do know is that when Elizabeth Taylor passed away in 2011, her coffin arrived 15 minutes late to the funeral, as instructed in her will. Because if there was one thing she could still control, even in death, it was this, the entrance. And somewhere, just maybe, Richard was waiting, not on a set, not on a yacht, but somewhere beyond the cameras, beyond the lights, where fame has no currency and love has no scripts. As we ended part 3, Elizabeth Taylor lay to rest with Richard Burton's final love letter clutched in silence, her last private possession in a life that had been so thoroughly public. But long before that final farewell, the betrayal that stung the most wasn't by any husband. It wasn't a broken vow or a lover's retreat. It was society's collective decision to no longer see her as a woman, only as a symbol. Because here's the painful truth. Elizabeth Taylor lived long enough to see her own myth become more valuable than her humanity. In her later years, the coverage of Taylor shifted in tone and not subtly. No longer the captivating beauty of the silver screen. She was described as bloated, unstable, erratic. Paparazzi cameras that once chased her elegance now hunted for weakness. Every cane she used, every wheelchair appearance, every wrinkle became a headline. It was as if the world was punishing her for aging in public. But was that really the offense? Or was it something deeper? Maybe it wasn't just that Elizabeth Taylor grew old. Maybe it was that she grew old without permission, without apology, without disappearing like other aging actresses were quietly expected to. In Hollywood, there's a price for surviving too long. Once you've outlived your desirability, your danger, your narrative utility, you become a problem. Not because you failed, but because you persisted. And Elizabeth persisted like no other. Even in the face of diminishing roles and tabloid ridicule, she refused to shrink. She walked red carpets with oxygen tanks. She smiled through surgeries. She gave interviews when others would have gone into hiding. And through it all, she kept speaking not lines from a script, but truths Hollywood didn't want to hear. She openly acknowledged her addictions. She didn't dodge questions about her past. In fact, she stared them down. In one famous interview, when asked about her string of failed marriages, she replied with disarming simplicity, "I'm not ashamed of who I loved. I'm ashamed of anyone who thinks I should be." And yet, for all her defiance, the media never fully forgave her for aging, or for not dying young, as legends are supposed to. It's ironic. Really, James Dean died at 24, and his legacy remains pristine, a face frozen in youth. Marilyn Monroe died at 36, and her vulnerability was forever embalmed in glamour. But Elizabeth Taylor lived, and kept living. She aged, faltered, endured, and in doing so, became harder to idolize, but infinitely more real. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe what frightened people wasn't her scandalous love life, or her political stances, or her transformation into an AIDS activist. Maybe what truly made her dangerous was her refusal to be anyone's fantasy anymore. She was no longer Cleopatra, or Maggie from Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, or the glowing bride of Mike Todd. She was Elizabeth battered by life, held together with surgical steel and willpower, still demanding space in a culture that had already tried to write her final scene. Even in death, she stirred discomfort. When she passed in 2011, speculation ran wild about where she'd be buried. Would it be beside Richard Burton, the man who haunted her heart? Would it be under a gravestone etched with diamonds? The truth was both simpler and sadder. Burton's widow had purchased the surrounding plots, ensuring Elizabeth would never be laid to rest next to him. And just like that, even in death, someone else wrote the ending. But Taylor had her own final word in the will. She requested her casket arrive late to the service. 15 minutes late. Fashionably, defiantly late. Because if they were going to bury her, they'd do it on her terms. Still, one can't help but wonder, why do we treat our icons this way? Why do we devour their triumphs, sensationalize their falls, then exile them for refusing to disappear on cue? Why do we reward youth with worship but punish survival with silence? Taylor's later life was not a tragedy. It was an act of rebellion. Every day she lived past her prime, past her contracts, past her critics, was a reminder that she was not made for anyone's comfort. She was inconvenient, And she knew it. She had seen every side of fame, the intoxicating highs, the humiliating betrayals, the lonely nights when the flashbulbs faded. She had watched friends like Montgomery Clift self-destruct, held Rock Hudson's hand as the world ignored his suffering, lost lovers to planes and pills and politics. And somehow, she remained, not because she was invincible, but because she had nowhere else to go. Fame wasn't her dream, it was her prison. And in a world that offered her no privacy, her only form of rebellion was visibility. So she stayed visible. Through the pain, through the ridicule, through the ache of being forgotten and the burden of being remembered too much. When we talk about Elizabeth Taylor, we often talk about the diamonds, the marriages, the scandals, but we forget the cost of that spotlight. We forget the weight of being desired by millions but loved by so few. She didn't get the ending she wanted. She wasn't buried beside the man who still whispered to her from the pages of an old letter. But she did get something just as rare, a life that was entirely, relentlessly, undeniably her own. And for that, Elizabeth Taylor was not just a star. She was a storm. To understand how radical Taylor's later life reinvention was, we have to revisit how completely she had been objectified. From adolescence onward, she was groomed to be adored, not understood, admired, not heard. Her beauty, while breathtaking, became a cage. It determined her value. It dictated her work. It even dictated when she was allowed to feel pain. Because when Elizabeth suffered, it was turned into spectacle. Her marriages were national debates. Her grief was exploited. Her stumbles, literal and metaphorical, were replayed with cruel delight. And every attempt she made to reclaim herself was filtered through the same tired headlines. Liz, out of control again. But here's what was rarely said: she never stopped trying. She didn't disappear. She didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned into the public eye and used it for something it wasn't designed for: healing. We often forget that long before celebrity activism became a fashionable accessory, Taylor was out there doing it when it was dangerous, unpopular even. In the early 1980s, when most of the world turned its back on AIDS victims, when fear and stigma eclipsed compassion, she stepped in, not as a figurehead, not as a spokesperson in a gown, but as a relentless fundraiser, organizer, and unapologetic truth teller. She sat in rooms where people didn't want to hear the word AIDS. She demanded action from government agencies and pharmaceutical companies who preferred to pretend the crisis didn't exist. And perhaps most notably, she risked further damage to her already fragile public image in a climate where merely being associated with the disease sparked panic and prejudice. But Elizabeth Taylor had lost too much to stay quiet. Rock Hudson's death was not just a personal loss, it was a moral awakening. She saw how the system had failed him. She saw how his suffering was sanitized, erased, and ultimately blamed on his identity. And she refused to allow that story to repeat itself. Her foundation, MFAR, raised over $80 million for research, education, and care. She hosted galas. She gave testimony. She challenged presidents. And she made it clear this wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about redemption. It was about love. Love for her friends. Love for justice. And maybe, finally, love for herself. Because through all the heartbreak, Taylor had begun to write a new script, one where she was no longer the tragic heroine or the scandalous siren, but the architect of her own legacy. She began to see her worth outside of romance. She found joy in friendship, in family, in activism, and in the small moments that never made the headlines: reading with her grandchildren, cooking at home, caring for her animals. Still, romance remained a thread, albeit a more nuanced one. Her final marriage, to construction worker Larry Fortensky, was perhaps the least conventional of them all. He was 20 years younger, far removed from the world of glitter and studio politics. And in that very distance, there was a kind of relief. For nearly 5 years, they shared something that looked suspiciously like peace. And when the marriage ended, it wasn't a media storm. It was mutual, quiet, almost unheard of for Elizabeth Taylor. By this stage in her life, the diamonds were still there, but they no longer defined her. She auctioned off some of her most famous pieces to fund hospitals, research, and charitable causes. One of the most legendary gems, the 69-carat Taylor Burton diamond, was sold to help build a hospital in Botswana. This wasn't rebranding. It was recentering. She was shifting the conversation from what she had to what she gave. And yet, even in these final chapters, the world kept trying to reduce her. She's a survivor. They said, as if surviving was a lucky accident and not the result of battle-hardened will. As if it wasn't excruciating to wake up every day in a body ravaged by over 40 surgeries, broken bones, and unrelenting pain. As if surviving decades of public humiliation, loss, betrayal, and medical trauma was anything but extraordinary. Elizabeth Taylor didn't just survive. She transformed. She transformed pain into purpose, gossip into generosity, fame into fuel for something far greater than fame itself. But here's the tragic irony. The very society that cheered her most daring roles often refused to give her credit for the boldest one of all, the role of a woman reclaiming her dignity. They preferred the scandal, the love triangles, the luxury, because it's easier to adore a fantasy than to reckon with a real person who outgrew the fantasy and dared to live on her own terms. And that brings us to a question that lingers. Why does it bother us so much when women like Elizabeth Taylor take up space beyond their beauty? Is it because we expect them to remain frozen in time, as if their image was ours to own? Or is it because watching them age, speak, and evolve reminds us uncomfortably of our own impermanence? Elizabeth Taylor refused to be frozen. She refused to be quiet. She refused to be punished for surviving the machine that chewed up so many before her. She did not die in a blaze of tragedy. She lived long enough to claim her story. And in doing so, she gave voice to something greater than herself. As we close this journey through the life of Elizabeth Taylor, let's pause where it matters most, not in the center of a red carpet flashbulb frenzy, not beneath the glare of paparazzi headlines, but in the stillness she left behind, in the silence. Because sometimes, what someone chooses not to say at the end of their life speaks louder than everything they ever allowed the world to hear. She had been called many things: goddess, diva, scandal maker, icon. But in the final years, there was only one title she seemed to embrace: Elizabeth. No more character, no more costume, no more apology. When she passed away in March 2011, the world didn't just lose a film legend. It lost one of its last living connections to an era when fame was forged through fire, not filters. But what's more haunting isn't her death. It's what she chose to take with her. Among the many treasures Elizabeth Taylor left behind: the art, the homes, the legacy foundations, there was one item she never let anyone see: Richard Burton's final letter. She received it days after his death in 1984. She read it once, quietly, then placed it in a drawer by her bed, where it remained for 27 years. She revealed enough to ignite the imagination. In that letter, Burton told her he wanted to come home. And for Elizabeth, that single sentence was enough to keep it sacred. She had published so many of his earlier letters, shared them in books, quoted them in interviews. But this one she held back. Why? Not out of shame, not out of pain, but perhaps because, for the first time in her life, she had something that belonged only to her. No camera saw it. No studio scripted it. No gossip columnist twisted it. It wasn't an object. It wasn't an ornament. It was love uncommodified, unbroadcast, unbroken. And in a life where so much had been stolen, branded, or packaged for mass consumption, that small piece of private devotion was her final act of ownership. She was buried with that letter, not beside Burton, not beneath a headline, but with a quiet defiance that felt more honest than any public declaration ever could. And maybe that's where her story bends, not toward tragedy, but toward reclamation, towards something rare, a woman who had been everyone's, finally becoming her own. The truth is, Elizabeth Taylor had nothing left to prove. She had already made the history books. She had redefined celebrity, paved the road for charity-driven fame, restructured gender expectations in public life, and survived the industry that once owned her. But here's the unsettling part: she never got to fully escape the myth. Even today, when people hear her name, the first thoughts are often diamonds and drama, not dignity and depth. Her image remains frozen in pop culture as a kind of eternal seductress, Cleopatra without the crown, a woman devoured by her own desires. But that isn't the whole truth. It never was. She wasn't destroyed by her appetites, she was destroyed by ours. Our appetite for women to be perfect, to stay beautiful, desirable, and silent. Our hunger for their pain as entertainment. Our expectation that once they become icons, they must remain motionless, ageless, voiceless. Elizabeth Taylor refused all of that. Not always gracefully, not always wisely, but always with authenticity. And for that, she became something more than famous. She became real. So what do we take from her story? That beauty fades? That fame is cruel? That love is elusive? Maybe. But look deeper. And there's something else. Something most of us miss in the noise. She kept going. Through scandal, addiction, illness, betrayal, she kept moving forward. Not because she believed in some fairy tale redemption arc, but because she believed that life, even in all its brokenness, was still worth claiming. She didn't choose the easy path. She didn't fade quietly into nostalgic interviews or afternoon cameos. She faced the weight of her own legend and decided not to carry it anymore. Not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as a story, messy, complicated, worthy of retelling, but never repeating. And perhaps that's her legacy. Not just the diamonds, or the movies, or the marriages, but the stubborn, radiant insistence that she belonged to no one but herself. In the end, Elizabeth Taylor didn't just outlive the studio system. She outlived the myth they built around her. And by doing so, she forced us to ask a question we still struggle with today. What does it mean for a woman to live fully, to love loudly, to age publicly, to suffer openly, and still be respected? Do we grant that right only to men? Or are we finally ready to let women be human even when they're iconic? These questions linger, unanswered, just like that final letter in Elizabeth's drawer, folded, untouched, unseen, but filled with meaning. Maybe the world never truly knew Elizabeth Taylor, but for those who looked closely past the headlines, past the diamonds, past the scandals, she left behind enough light to follow, enough truth to remember, and enough mystery to remind us that some stories are not meant to be solved, only honored. She was not a tragedy. She was not a trophy. She was not your fantasy. She was Elizabeth, and that, finally, was enough. So in the end, maybe it was never really about Elizabeth Taylor. Maybe it was about us, the way we consume women in the spotlight, the way we praise their beauty until it threatens us, the way we mourn their downfall when we've helped engineer it. We turn them into icons, then wonder why they shatter like glass when they try to breathe. Elizabeth lived a life most would envy, and yet, when you strip away the gowns, the husbands, the million-dollar stones, what's left is a woman who spent decades trying to answer one question: who do I get to be when I'm not being watched? And maybe that's a question we all carry, whether we're stars or strangers. She wasn't perfect. She never claimed to be, but she was honest in a world that punishes honesty, especially from women who've dared to live on their own terms. So before we call her a legend, a diva, a queen, perhaps we should ask ourselves what it truly means to outlive your own myth, and whether we would survive the same. Thank you for watching and staying with us through this story. If this moved you, challenged you, or made you see Elizabeth or yourself differently, then don't let this be the end. Subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you never miss the truths hiding behind the lights. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and stay human. Goodbye, and we'll see you soon.